Hello there, and welcome to episode 8 of the Chess Cybersecurity video series. Today we're going to be talking about architecture and configuration, so the sort of what it is, how you do it, and why we need it. And we've got Peter from Cisco, and we've got Lucian from TD Synnex.
Hi, I'm Peter Morris. I'm a partner systems engineer at Cisco.
Hi, my name is Lucian Coman. I'm a technical Presales Consultant at TD Synnex.
Okay, well, thanks for joining me here today, guys, and thanks for taking time. I know that we're all quite busy. So we'll start off with, why do we need to consider cybersecurity in the architecture and configuration of our systems? I mean, you need to is the obvious answer. You wouldn't build a house with no security in it because it's going to have all our stuff in it. So I'll pass that over to you first, Peter, so you can talk about it from a network perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of security, right, it all comes down to policy, right? And your policies are only as good as you make them to be, right? Yeah. So always for me, this question, my brain goes straight to the possibility for human error, right? And how confident are you that the policies that you are configuring are actually in accordance with what you're trying to achieve, right? And that's a more complex question, I think, than it seems sometimes at first glance, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd agree with that 100%.
And also I think it's about preparing and understanding what you need to secure in your environment. Absolutely. And do an assessment of what you actually have, how many machines you have, how many servers you have. Are they on-prem? Are they on cloud? So think about strategically thinking about what you have, what's the outcome, what do you need to protect, what are your risky assets? And do a risk assessment and understand from all those servers that you have, which one of the most important that you have. And also consider your users. How many users you have? What operating system they're using? Laptops, desktop, working from home? Because that can change, especially from a network perspective, but also from an endpoint security perspective, will change the architecture of the security environment. Yeah. Because after the COVID, everything has changed. Now it's starting to get back into the office, but it's still a very dispersed system now with user working from home, users working in the office. Your servers can be on-prem, moving to cloud. So everything now needs to be strategically thinking about, what do I need to do and what do I need to secure first? And then think and create a strategy around that.
Absolutely. I think that's some really good points there. Now, I mean, one of the things that I always come back to with this is that you touched upon the fact that the architectures are changing now, but there's still a lot of organizations that are using architectures that were designed, 10, 20 years ago, when, a lot of this stuff, there was security considerations, but the types of security threats that that were conceived of back then was really someone trying to hack into the system, and it wasn't really to cause massive disruption or access denial to data and things like that. It was more to be a nuisance really, and just to do it whether they could or not. So I think that's one of the challenges around these systems that we've got, sort of some of these older systems, that the legacy type systems. And those systems were just not built for the modern threats,
Yeah, I think there is a security in a box, I would call it like that, because you used to secure your zone, your entry, you have your servers, you had any internet connection on that one. Now everything comes with a cloud connection, you need an internet connection. So those things are started to complicate that IT security and that architecture and the configuration of your systems.
I totally agree, and I think when I think about that kind of stuff, I often like to break it down in my head into 3 kind of categories, right? When we talk about networking, at least, we speak about users, obviously. We speak about workloads and applications that they're trying to access, but also the location and the path of traffic between a user and an application. That's a variable in there as well, right? And Lucian, you mentioned about COVID. I think for a lot of organizations, the challenge that immediately presented is that flow of data is totally different. And if you'd invested hugely in on-premise security, which a lot of organizations had historically, it's a whole different ballgame all of a sudden, and that's something that's outside of your control, right? So I think that's a huge example, right, with COVID. But also a lot of organizations are somewhere along this migration to cloud. Right, and realistically multi-cloud for a lot of organizations. It's no longer the case that my workload sits in my data center, which sits in my office, and that's where I need to apply my investments.
Yeah.
Because actually, a lot of the time, I'm using public cloud or private cloud, or in reality, a mixture of the two, and certain parts of my application sit somewhere and are interfacing with microservices that sit elsewhere. And the reality is the landscape now is increasingly complex. If you combine that with the more sophisticated threats that we're seeing now, it has this compounding factor, right? It's becoming exponentially more difficult to ensure that you're getting a consistent level of protection as you were before.
It's true, especially exactly also with the endpoint. Yeah, in the past used to be a desktop inside an office, so the security of that one, it didn't go anywhere, and everything was mitigated around that firewall that sits on the edge. But now that user is remotely, is working from home, is working maybe from a shared location with anybody. So that's the network security needs to step up to create that tunneling perfect for the end user, but also the endpoint starts to become more important and add multiple feature to this function, because you need to protect that end user even though it's home in a hotel, which maybe doesn't want to turn the VPN connection. So then your endpoint needs to make sure that it's working and it's doing and applying the same policy as you were in the office.
Yeah, and I think the VPN point is a great one, right? Because there's a reason that people don't turn the VPN on when we think they should, right? And it's because they feel that it compromises the quality of experience. I'm not going to use the VPN because it's a little bit slow, or something like that, or it's a pain, right?
Certainly, that's certainly true of
maybe
the older technologies. Yeah, that's I mean, because you're talking about maybe in most organisations, you're going to have at least a couple of dozen people coming in. That you're not just going to give them unlimited bandwidth across them.
Nope.
It's less of a bandwidth into the office is much less of a problem now than it used to be, but certainly historically, that the VPN was very much seen as the sort of the snail's pace sort of network connection. And it's over VPN, it takes forever.
And we have things like, sorry, Lucian, I was going to say we have things like zero trust network access now, but that requires re-architecting the solution, right? It's not as simple as just rip and replacing a VPN service. No. It is much more involved than that, and so actually to go down that journey requires a decent bit of work.
It requires the foreplanning, and that kind of brings me on to the second part of this discussion, and that's sort of what does architecture and configuration mean. And one of the key points that Lucian already alluded to is understand what you're building and why you're doing it, and that kind of leads on very nicely from what you were just saying then.
Yeah. I think like we said, right, that if you break it down into those components of kind of a location or a workplace, that the types of users and the different requirements we have for different kinds of users, right? These kinds of things introduce a need for adaptive MFA, as an example, right? We have to be much more clever about how we apply a policy to whom and when. And I think for a lot of organizations, it's a losing battle because as we discussed, it's getting more complex. So it's really critical that we actually give users the tools they need to understand the landscape that they're trying to protect, right?
But also it's also the design aspect of when you do the architecture, you need to design. It's like, imagine when you build your house, you want to be a 3-bedroom house, you need to have one toilet downstairs, a toilet upstairs, you want different things. Same you need to do with security. You have to think all about it and put them on paper and do a planning. I've seen different customers just buying an AV or an endpoint security for the sake of having an endpoint security, which they haven't had any plan and any architecture on that one. And
that's it, and that sort of follows on really what I was saying, that it's when I'm talking to customers, it's always about, right, you've come to me and you've said that you've got this requirement, but the solution that we decide upon here is not just about making a snap decision now. We should also be looking at what is it that you're going to do in the future as well, and start preempting for that. And that kind of goes back to what you were saying around, you're not just going to do a rip and replace straight away to implement a secure infrastructure. And it's one of the key recommendations around architects and solutions and stuff like that is making sure that as you're building the solution, one of the tenets of it is to make sure that it's built with a view to being able to be updated, that, there is functionality there either via redundancy, so that you can take elements of the network away to update them. And I think that plays sort of quite easily into what you're saying there, that you need to be looking at the larger picture. And certainly, when you're coming to do your network refresh, or if you're looking at replacing part of the network, you should be looking at what are the next steps that you're going to do and start to build those, the integrations sooner rather than later with that.
Yeah, and make it easy to be managed in the future. Think about updating that one, how often you do update that one, and add different step inside your planning process in order to look up 1, 2, 3 years in front, but also take small steps to always continue improving your systems, because cybersecurity and security is evolving by the day. As we're talking, 1 million of malware pieces have been created every day. So those landscape can continue to evolve, and also so they need to change their planning, and also they need to.
They're making money off doing it,
exactly.
So why
so
would
they're
they
making
stop?
ton of money of doing that one. So we need to be proactive all the time to be a step of that one.
Yeah, and that's the value of things like threat intelligence, right? It's critical that you have, as much as you can, bleeding edge threat intelligence, because it's a really simple way of actually making sure that you are keeping pace with attackers, right? How often are you going to revisit the architecture of your security landscape, right? Not all that often, because it's a big bit of work, and actually it does introduce some risk itself, right?
And it's massively disruptive as well to an operating business. If you want to start ripping the network apart and cutting areas of the network off, and maybe cutting off services that customers need and stuff like that, it's not that easy. But this, and again, I think that segues quite nicely into one of the other points that I wanted to make. And again, it's talking about a lot of the time that we're dealing with these architectures that were originally conceived of quite a long time ago, and unless it was designed to be a very secure system because it was carrying confidential information or classified information, maybe for government or military applications, the systems won't have been architected in a way that segments them and makes lateral traversal very difficult, which is obviously one of the key recommendations that most of the attack frameworks that you see out there now will recommend this, such that if one area of the network gets compromised, it doesn't necessarily spread elsewhere.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that can come back to context, right? And not just looking at a potential attack in isolation, but the bigger picture of what is happening here. How is this threat got into my network in the first place? What is the smallest slice of my network that I can quarantine without affecting the quality of service, right? And a lot of that requires the exchange of information between different parts in that security chain. As an example, if you have a DNS solution and a firewall and a cloud security solution, are these things integrated? Because it's about building a better picture. And God forbid there is some kind of security incident, do you have the visibility you need to review how that happened, and how do you plug that hole in the ship?
Absolutely, and that brings me to the next point that I was just going to raise, that you've just made quite succinctly there, that it's when designing the networks, monitoring is more important than ever, because it's not, we've talked in the other sessions that we've done around monitoring from endpoints, from servers, from cloud instances and stuff like that. But network monitoring is vitally important as well, because again, that little breadcrumb of information, or those breadcrumbs of information that sort of lead you to believe that, well, all of those failed authentication attempts from a device that doesn't normally try and authenticate to that source, that they're indicators of compromise. And the better monitoring that we have, the better detection that we have, and the better detection that we have, the less damage is going to be done, because we'll be able to catch it before anything actually happens. And then the final point on this is, again, talking about segmentation. And if you're an organization that is developing your own in-house software, or you are at a scale where you've been able to actually develop your own development platform so that you can test things out prior to affecting the production one, make sure that the two systems aren't linked. I've seen that so many times that I'm not going to admit to being guilty of doing something similar myself in the past, but it does save time. But it also means that a compromise to one of those systems where things are maybe a little bit fast and loose because it's not a production system. If it can jump across to the production system, that's a bit of a no-brainer.
Testing is very important, especially in security. You need to test it before putting into
Certainly
the live
if you're developing your own stuff anyway.
Exactly. When we're talking about security policy, if you don't test them before, you might have a major disruption into your environment just because you apply the policy that haven't been tested on a specific set of people.
Yeah.
Again, you need to create, when you're talking about architecture, you need to create that change management. And everything that is changed into the organization needs to bypass by a change in order to make sure that that change, when it's introduced to the environment, will actually be what you want.
Absolutely.
And mitigate that part of the change.
Yeah, and I suspect part of the challenge, especially with if you're developing your own software, is the individuals who are managing that CI/CD pipeline are not necessarily the same individuals who are going to be looking at it from a security lens.
No, never.
They're just trying to do their bit, and they
exactly. So they don't care about security, and
so it's absolutely an understanding thing, right? It's about mutually. Do those individuals who are managing your security solutions understand the application that they're trying to protect really, and do your application owners understand what your security policy is to make sure that when they are designing that software, they're not making any missteps. And I think that's how we organize businesses, right? It's logical, but at the same time, there is a little bit of work that you need to do in there to make sure that you are not making any risks that don't need to be made.
And that's why it's quite important to the architecture of your security and understand everything that's going to happen or happening into your environment to make sure that you're covering those risks.
Right.
And make sure that you put all the security measure in place to mitigate majority of them. Because to be honest, there's no 100% secure systems,
Sure.
But we are doing the best effort to secure and mitigate the more things we know about them.
Yeah, and you don't want to set and forget, right? You don't want to sit there and be reactive. You want to have the tools you need to be proactive.
Absolutely.
Because that comes back to what we were speaking earlier about understanding what you're trying to accomplish, right? Is you need the tool set. You need the tool set to say, oh, I can see that this user's accessed this application. I don't know what that is. And so, sure, I can get some number that gives me an indication of compromise. That's a starter for 10. But where do I go next? What we said earlier about policy and actually understanding the applications you're trying to protect, a lot of the time you don't know. And so you need the tools.
No, absolutely. All of this is great in theory, but how do we practically implement this stuff when we've got these older environments? So I think understanding these secure architecture principles is vital, and that's kind of where Cisco really excels, I think.
Yeah, I think that kind of is our strength, right? We spoke earlier about networking, but these things are not separate. Networking and security are not separate conversations.
No.
Absolutely.
They go hand in hand.
They do. And so it doesn't make sense to buy point products and then try and figure out how you glue them together, right? There needs to be a really deep integration. We've tried to innovate in certain areas, like we spoke earlier about segmentation. We get a lot of customers now who are using the application hosting platform. We have a container platform on some of our switches that allows you to run things like a containerized firewall. It's about flexibility, because if you don't have that flexibility, you're trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole, right? So networking security is the same thing. It's the same conversation, right? I think that's one point that I would want to make. Another point that I would want to make is about the observability thing. The reality is, like we've said many times, the threat landscape is incredibly complex. Most organizations are on this kind of cloud journey, but a lot of the time the reason for introducing risk is user experience. And it comes back to the VPN thing, right? I'm not going to turn the VPN on because it's a little slow or it's adding complexity. Well, complexity in some ways is a good thing, because you're adding more layers upon which you can catch something that might otherwise slip through the net.
Absolutely, rather than putting all your eggs in one basket, or
definitely
the onion and the egg is another adage that I've used for years and years of having a layered approach to security as opposed to just
a multiple
having
layer security defense is a must.
Totally, but you balance that with the observability. So if I've got if I think about it as a chain, if I've got 10 links in that chain versus 2 or 3, well, there are more points of failure. So do I have the visibility where if I've got, it might not be a total lack of access, but more latency and things like that, do I know where that's occurring? And that's why we have tools like Thousand Eyes that help us actually understand where is the problem, because it's about not compromising security for user experience or vice versa.
Yeah. We've talked about putting these architectures in place and having monitoring and building them in a secure manner so that, we can minimize damage that's being done by an attacker. But there's always that stark panic when you suddenly realize that there's something going on in your systems that's beyond your control. You don't quite understand it, especially if people are starting to get ransomware warnings or something like that, or any of the other sort of scary things that can happen in an incident. And making sure that you're able to respond to these things quickly, I think is important.
I have two answers on this one. There are those companies that have their internal security guys, yeah. So those guys will have plan in place, yeah. They'll have a disaster recovery. They will know an incident management. Then they will know what to do. But most of the customers, they no longer have the skills on security. They no longer know security. If you look at, I'm looking at my customer base and I'm talking to a couple of customers every single day. Many of them is an IT guy. That IT guy is the IT manager, is the patch manager, is the security manager, is all hats in one single person.
It's a constant
and it
problem.
doesn't know. So that brings me to the discussion of what's happening, what's next, yeah? So if you look at the market and everything going to managed services, yeah? So why not go and secure and make sure that you have that knowledge and people that is looking after an incident management in time of security and buy cybersecurity as a service? And I think that's where everything is going. Because again, if we do the analogy around to build your own SOC, yeah, you'll need at least 5 or 6 guys, yeah? And if you look at how much it's going to cost you,
the cost becomes inhibitive so quickly, and then you're straight away into making compromises. Well, we won't run it 24/7, and then it's like, well, if you're not going to do that, then what is it worth doing it at all?
And I'm not talking about red team, blue teams, gray teams. It's so many things you add up into the security that can increase your cost year by year. Then I think it's a natural move when then everyone predicts that everything is going to go to managed services in the near future.
Yeah, I do agree. Cisco, as you know, Adam, we've just recently unveiled our new XDR platform. And I think there will be a lot of particularly large enterprises who decide that they are going to run and operate that themselves. But increasingly, I think the bulk of the conversation, certainly for smaller organizations, and I don't mean small at all, but not large enterprises, right, are going to want to consume that, as you said, Lucian, as a service. And that's why, as part of that platform, it's really critical that we have all these APIs and things and opportunities to extend that platform and embed it into a managed SOC. Because increasingly, I think you're right, that is how customers are going to want to consume it, because it avoids any internal finger pointing. It allows you to have a predictable, recurring charge for that, as opposed to something that could easily grow arms and legs and become very unwieldy very quickly.
I think with the just to the final thought really, that with these managed services, it's something that everyone wins at. The people that are supplying them win because they can build a successful business model around it. But I think customers, the customer's not getting the losing end of the deal, because they're getting invaluable experience for a much lower cost than it would cost them to employ and set up the equivalent of that. I think that's all we've got time for today. Thank you both very much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you taking time out. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you next time. Stay secure.